All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 4 of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles. So we're continuing our studies on the Feast of Joy, and we've looked at the joy in receiving the blessings from God. We've looked at the joy in the gift of being able to give gifts and to share together during the Feast of Tabernacles. And yesterday we looked at what did we look at yesterday? I've just gone a blank for a moment. We looked at the joy of peace, of finding peace in the Feast of Tabernacles. So this morning we are going to look at the joy of fellowship in the Feast of Tabernacles. And it's interesting that as we look at this theme, one of the things I'm going to focus on is the subject of water in the Feast of Tabernacles, which is the subject of harmony or fellowship. And I have this slide, which is one that I've used before on another study, but one of the beautiful things with water is that gentle flowing water teaches a lot of lessons in its ability to be able to resolve conflict without confrontation. So when water flows and it comes against a rock or an obstacle, a branch, it manages to find a path without confrontation. And it always finds a way, and it does so in a gentle way. So there's the lesson that water teaches in harmony. And anyway, I thought that was interesting because I woke up this morning to a lake out the front of our section. And that's a quick little picture of the lake, which has appeared overnight because we had an enormous amount of water. And on our lake this morning, we have a massive variety of bird life, more so than I've ever seen. We, in fact, I haven't got a picture in this photo, but I think we've even got a heron. So we've got herons and pukekos and ducks and swallows and all sorts of things on the water at the moment. So the bird life has just come alive because we now have a lake. So I think this concept of water in its ability to be able to attract a diversity of God's creation teaches this principle of fellowship. But we need to tie this all together with the Feast of Tabernacles. So I'm going to give you your first challenge here. Who knows what this is a picture of? Feel free to jump on your microphones. If anyone knows what this is.
Could be Coronet Peak.
Coronet Peak? Any advances on Coronet Peak?
A mountain with some birds flying in the foreground and lots of clouds, and it's old.
Lake Taupo? No?
No.
Markables?
No.
Mount Narahoe, Tongariro.
No.
No.
That is Mount Hermon. So
What's
that
that
is Mount Hermon in Israel, northern, up above on the heights of Lebanon, coming down, looking up north of the Sea of Galilee. And the reason why I've got that photo there is it becomes a major picture of the subject of water and life for Israel. And that comes out of this beautiful psalm. This is one of my favorite psalms. It's only 3 verses long. We sing this as a hymn. It's one of the songs of degrees. And if you know the story of the songs of degrees, they were compiled by Hezekiah after the destruction of the Assyrian, and it really celebrated the story of deliverance. So these psalms were set in order to celebrate deliverance from the Assyrian. And this psalm is really this beautiful psalm about unity. And the verse 1 there, a great verse, how good and how pleasant it is for brothers to dwell together in unity. And then the psalmist goes on to make two comparisons of just what that unity is made up of. And the first comparison he uses is he says, well, it's like the ointment that runs down the beard of Aaron and down to his skirts of his garments. And you sort of think, well, how is that unity? Why is he drawing this picture? Well, when you look at the story of the sons of Aaron and the Levites, one of the things with this record is it says of his father and mother, this is a blessing to Levi, he says, I don't know them. He didn't acknowledge his brothers or his children, for he observed the word and kept his covenant. Now that's a reference back to the golden calf. If you remember, the Levites separated themselves unto God, and they disassociated themselves with the rest of the tribes who were committing idolatry. But because of that, they were given the priesthood. And the priesthood was this unique relationship where they had no inheritance in the land of Israel, and they were to dwell in the different tribes amongst the other tribes, and they were to be given an inheritance amongst the rest of the tribes to teach them the way of God's law. So, if you like, this story of the Levites and the story of the priests, they were given as a gift to Israel to teach the principle that spiritual families trump natural families. That's the lesson. This spiritual family, the priesthood, trumped the natural family, the natural line, and they were a gift from God. And so when you see this picture that you see in the screen and you see the ointment running down the beard of Aaron, it would flow onto what? It would flow onto the breastplate, which had the 12 stones representing the 12 tribes, and the oil would flow over the 12 tribes, over the breastplate. And that's a picture of God's blessing that he was using the sons of Aaron to bring a spiritual blessing on the whole house of Israel. So that's the first analogy that's given in this Psalm of unity. The second analogy is it's like the dew of Hermon, it says, which falls on the mountains of Zion. So in the heights of Hermon, up there in the northernmost heights, up in Lebanon, the snow-capped mountain of Hermon became the water source of the entire nation. In fact, one of the rabbi's teaching was that Mount Hermon, the highest mountain in Israel, is covered with snow all winter. When the snow mounts, it becomes a forceful river and it feeds the Sea of Galilee, and beyond that it feeds Jordan. Thus, the snow-covered Hermon is the water source for the entire land of Israel. So you get this picture of there up in the north, the dew of Hermon just permeating through the land of Israel. And all the springs that come through the land all come from that incredible water source at the head of Hermon. So those are the two pictures of unity that God gives: the oil, which is the blessing through the priesthood, and the water or the dew that comes from Hermon. So let's tie this up to our story of the Feast of Tabernacles, and we want to go to the story of Solomon. So when Solomon dedicated the temple, we discover that it was actually at the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, and they kept the feast. So in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, after 7 years of building this incredible building, Solomon gathered the whole nation together, and they keep the feast 7 days. And later on in the record, you'll see that it's definitely the Feast of Tabernacles, because he sent them home on the 23rd day of the 7th month, which happens to be the great Shemonite Etzerets, the last or 8th day of the feast. So Solomon, it says, held the feast for 7 days, and there was a great assembly that he gathered, and it's designated that they came from Lebo Hamath unto the brook of Egypt. So why does it mention these two places? Well, when we look at Joshua, it says the land of the Gabalites and all of Lebanon toward the sunrise, from Baal Gad below Mount Hermon to Lebo Hamath. Lebo Hamath was the northernmost territory at the foot of Hermon. It was at the base of Hermon to the north. And of course, the brook of Egypt was the southernmost border. And the emphasis that is going on here with Solomon's temple is he gathered them from Hermon to the river of Egypt, all the children of Israel together, to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And one of the interesting things is at that time, it's one of the few times that you find in the Bible where it says specifically, during that time, the glory of the Lord appeared. It says, as soon as Solomon finished his prayer, fire came down from heaven, consumed the burnt offering and sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. This was the time of the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, I can't prove it exactly, but we know that Moses, when he ascended up to Mount Sinai, when they gathered at Mount Sinai, it was around the time of the Feast of Pentecost. And Moses was given instructions of how to build the tabernacle when he went up to Mount Sinai. I can't prove it, but or not that I've seen, but I think they built the tabernacle, they erected the tabernacle, and they set it up and completed it in time for the celebration of the 7th month and the Feast of Tabernacles. And the glory of the Lord appeared over the tabernacle at exactly that time. So that's a little bit of speculation, but it does fit this whole principle, doesn't it? You know, when we think about Jesus, it says the Word became flesh and lived in his tent amongst us. We gazed at his glory as the glory of the only begotten Father, full of grace and truth. So Jesus is the ultimate glory of God. And he was seen in his, at the time of his birth, at the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, and at the time of his baptism, when the glory of God was heard from heaven, and the voice of God spoke, and the Spirit of God descended like a dove and rested upon him. So we saw the glory of God revealed from heaven at Jesus' baptism, just like the glory of God was revealed at the time of Solomon. And I think the glory of God was revealed at the time of the building of the tabernacle, and they all happen at the Feast of Tabernacles. It's all the same time. So in this theme of glory, as we're looking at the story of Tabernacles, one of the things about God's glory is it's revealed in unity. It's revealed in this beautiful harmony. The heavens declare the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of his hands. And when you look at it, the diversity of stars, and he knows them all by name, they declare unity. They are his creation, so diverse beyond our comprehension in terms of their chemical makeup, the distance they have from each other, the size. Stars are just like holes in heaven from Earth, like little dots. But we know that they are amazingly diverse. and yet they're all God's glory. In fact, the heavens is a picture, or the glory of the heavens is a picture of the tabernacle. It says in Isaiah 4, the Lord will create over the whole of Mount Zion and over her assembly a cloud by day and smoke and of shining flaming fire by night, and over all the glory there will be a canopy, and there will be a booth, a tabernacle, to shade by day from heat, and a refuge and a shelter from the storm and the rain. So this picture of God's glory is a picture of the tabernacle itself. And this section in Isaiah leads to one of the greatest sections in Isaiah of unity, the section of what we know to be the Emmanuel prophecies. And the story really about Isaiah chapter 7 to 12 is going to be the work of the child that will come from God, Emmanuel, God with us, and he's going to gather the outcasts of Israel. He's going to assemble the dispersed from all the corners of the world, and he's going to bring them back, and he's going to make them one. So the story of the glory of God as it's revealed in Emmanuel in Isaiah 7 to 12 is the story of fellowship. It's the story of restoration of the 12 tribes. So with that, let's now look at our next section that we want to look at in regards to the story of fellowship. And we're going to go to the story of John chapter 7. So this is probably worth looking up because there's a lot in this section. And at the heart of this story in John chapter 7, which is the story when Jesus goes up to Jerusalem, specifically to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. So if we read John chapter 7 in verse 1 and 2, it says, after this, Jesus went about in Galilee, and he didn't want to go, or he would not go to Judea, because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Now the Jews' feast of booths was at hand. So we've got the timing set for John chapter 7. It's the same time we're in right now. It's the Feast of Tabernacles. It is Jesus' birthday. It's a hugely significant time, and it's a time of joy, and it's a time when, even in Jesus' day, many people would have gone up to Jerusalem, and as we were talking with Neil yesterday, people would have made booths on their rooftops. They would have made booths in the court of the temple. So you imagine this picture of what Jerusalem was like at this time. And it's in the middle of this feast, verse 14, when Jesus goes up into the temple and begins to teach. And then there was this period for day after day in the middle of the feast, probably right about today. We're in day 4. The feast actually lasted for 7 days, but then there was an 8th day. So if you want to know what timing this was when Jesus went up into the temple, it would be exactly today. This is the time when Jesus went up in the temple to teach. And he taught them, and then there was this division amongst the people, because at this time, this is 6 months before his death, he had become very popular, but because the Jewish leaders hadn't accepted him, there was this question over his natural lineage, where he came from. And there was this huge debate. Now, one of the things which is key to the story of the Feast of Tabernacles was every day during the Feast of Tabernacles, there was what was called the water pouring ceremony. And as we mentioned in yesterday's study, I think it was, there were a lot of sacrifices going on during the Feast of Tabernacles. There were 70 bulls that were killed during the Feast of Tabernacles. So they would go down and they would get a lot of water, and they would all wander down on what this was called down to the pool of Siloam. And the picture that you see there is an ancient picture of the procession of what was called the water pouring ceremony. And they would blow the trumpets and they would sing different psalms. They would actually sing some of the psalms of the songs of the degrees, Psalm 133 that we just read. They would be singing these psalms as they went down to the pool of Siloam and gather this water and take it back up into the temple. And it would be used for ceremonial cleansing. It would be used for washing all the blood of the sacrifices. And so this was this picture that you had. And on the picture on the right is actually modern day. So even today, modern day Jews are doing exactly the same thing. They go down to the pool of Siloam and they get water and they keep the Feast of Tabernacles. So it's an amazing picture of the story of the Feast of Tabernacles and drawing water from the waters of Siloam. The last part of the story of the Emmanuel prophecies climaxes with this beautiful picture, which says in Isaiah 12 verse 3, with joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation. So here's this picture of the Feast of Tabernacles, drawing water from the pool of Siloam. And if you go through the story of the Emmanuel prophecy and look at the story of Siloam, it's there in every chapter. It starts, of course, with the message coming to Ahaz about the promise of the Messiah, the promise of God's child. And the promise was delivered to Ahaz at the Gihon Spring outside of Jerusalem, which was the water source for the city. It was the life source. And it finishes with this picture of this water bubbling up inside the city. So Jesus appears on the last day of the feast. It's called the Great Day of the Feast. Now, I think there's a debate whether this is the 7th day or the 8th day of the feast, the 8th day being called Shemini Etzrat. Edersheim, I think, suggests that it's the 7th day. I believe it's the 7th day, not the 8th day. I don't think it really, I think the significance doesn't matter too much, but in our next study, we'll look a lot closer tomorrow at the 8th day of the feast, what was called Shemini Etzrat. Anyway, on the 7th day of the feasts, they went down to the pool of Siloam and got the water down from the pool of Siloam, and they marched down 7 times, and they marched around the altar 7 times. It was the great water pouring ceremony of the feast. So this quote here was read during the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles, and it was a significant time period of celebrating God's deliverance of the city in the days of Hezekiah. So that was custom, what was done in Jesus' day. And it was at this time when Jesus suddenly comes and he appears on the last day of the feast. And he says, verse 37, on the last day of the feast, the great day, Jesus stood up and cried out, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scriptures said, out of his heart or out of his belly, it should be, shall flow forth living waters. Here's this picture that Jesus says. Now, this is the middle of summer. Everyone's really hot. Well, it's at the end of summer, should I say. It would have been really hot. and they're following the priests down, and they're watching the priests go down into the water and get this water, march back up to the temple. And at that time, Jesus stands up and makes this incredible statement. Now, there's a few things that Jesus is referring to here. In the story of the wilderness wanderings, as God led them through the wilderness, he provided for them a source of life which came from the belly of a rock. You remember Moses smote the rock, and out of the rock flowed living waters, which provided for them in the wilderness, which was what the story of Tabernacles was all about. I led you through the wilderness and I provided for you. So that was one of the pictures of out of the belly of the rock. And when we read in Corinthians, that rock was Christ. It was a picture of the time of Christ standing up at the Feast of Tabernacles and saying, any man thirst, let him come to me. Out of his belly will flow forth living waters. But the Jews, or the people in Jesus' day, were questioning as to who Jesus was, where he would come from. And the reason why is because they had this concept which came from the likes of Daniel, where it says in Daniel chapter 7, I was watching in the night visions and the clouds in the sky, and one like the Son of Man approaching. He went from the Ancient of Days and was escorted before him, and he made a sudden descent. So the picture of Jesus or Messiah, and Malachi chapter 3 says the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. And so there was this belief that Messiah would just be like Superman. It's a bird, it's a plane. Oh no, it's the Messiah, that he would suddenly appear from the heavens. The problem was they looked at Jesus and they said, but we know where he comes from. We know his natural birth, his natural lineage. We know he comes out of Galilee. We know he came from Nazareth. So they struggled to see Jesus as the Messiah because they only could see him from his natural birth. They couldn't see him from his spiritual birth. You know, they said, well, Nathanael said, can any good thing come out of Galilee? And then later in this chapter, the high priests said to Nicodemus, are you also of Galilee? Search and look, for out of Galilee arises no prophet. So like Nathanael, there was this massive discrimination about Galilee, about Nazareth. Amazing part about it is that when you think about the glory of Hermon and the waters that flowed down, they were like the first to receive the blessing. They were the northernmost kingdoms. And in fact, if they'd have read Isaiah chapter 9, so when you come back to Isaiah chapter 9, this is the story of Messiah. This is where he was going to come from if they had really read Isaiah chapter 9. So it said, the people that walked in darkness, verse 1. In former time, Zebulun, the land of Naphtali, he has made glorious by way of the sea, the land beyond Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people who walk in darkness have seen a great light. So they had this massive discrimination towards Jesus because they could only see his natural birth. But Jesus said that we needed to be born from above. And Isaiah chapter 9 is the story about the spiritual birth of Jesus, isn't it? For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. His name shall be called the Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. The whole story of that section of Isaiah is about Emmanuel, God with us. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son. It was the story of the spiritual lineage of Jesus, his direct connection to God. And Jesus said, you all must be born from above. And let's tie this up for a minute in terms of thinking about what this really means. Because this is an essential part of the story of the Feast of Tabernacles. What fellowship during this time of the Tabernacles really means. And what is the depth of joy in this fellowship? So when Jesus talks about living waters out of the belly, we can think about the rock in the wilderness, but we can also think about the natural process of childbirth. So inside a woman with child are living waters. And inside those living waters, inside her belly, is a miracle that is happening. The natural birth of a child. But there are living waters by which we are born from above. And the spiritual birth is the same process, but it's not quite seen the same way, is it? And if we think about that, here's the point Jesus makes. Who is my Father? Whoever does the will of my Father in heaven, the same as my brother, my sister, my mother. John chapter 7 is all about how the fact that the people in Jesus' day could not recognize him because they were focused on his natural lineage. But his spiritual connection and his lineage did directly come from God. They couldn't see. So they missed Isaiah chapter 9. But we can do the same thing. We can be focused upon our natural lineage, our connections that we have, bone of bone, flesh of flesh, to our brothers and sisters in the flesh. But the point is that our spiritual relationship with each other trumps our natural relationships in this world. We are born from above. To as many as received him, to them he gave power to become sons and daughters of God. Our spiritual connection, our spiritual family ought to be stronger than our natural family. Now, if you think about that as a principle in fellowship, our fellowship should have a dimension which is so great. We should be so protective of each other. How much does a father want to protect his own child? How much does a mother want to protect her own child? That should be the type of relationship we have with each other. Whosoever does the will of my Father, the same as my brother, my sister, my mother. And it's taught in the principle of the Levites. They forsook their mother and father, and they clave to the spiritual family of the whole house of Israel. Cry out and shout, thou inhabitant of Zion, for great is the Holy One in the midst of thee.